everyone. Lauren here. Welcome back to another episode of Big Ideas. And I'm really excited for you all to hear this podcast. I got to interview Jay Brown, and he has one of the longest running yoga podcasts out there. He's just passed 10 years and 500 episodes. He hasn't missed a Monday drop in that long, which is just incredible. And I've been on his podcast 2 or 3 times. He has interviewed virtually everyone in the yoga world, and he has a really particular insight because of that into the challenges and opportunities in the current yoga climate. And we talked about all kinds of fascinating insights into the yoga world and what's going on right now and some of the backlash and why that's happened. It was so fun to talk with him, and I think you're going to have as much fun as I did listening in. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Jay Brown, welcome to Big Ideas. I'm so excited to have you on my podcast. This is a different twist.
I'm excited to be here. I'm overjoyed. I can't wait. It's fun. Honestly, I don't know how long you've been doing this show, but when you mentioned it and you invited me, there was no hesitation. I'm overjoyed to be here with you.
I love that. I'm so happy to have you here. And you know, the germ of this started because I was in another meeting with some other teachers, and 2 of the people, and not in my company, in a different company that we work with, said they had seen you at this yoga festival and it was so amazing. And then one of them had actually trained with you, and it was just like, wow, I haven't talked to Jay in so long. And here he's coming up in this meeting that is totally a sidebar for what's going on. And so I reached out to you. And then, of course, I wanted to catch up with you before we were here on film, on pod. And so I scrolled through and started to listen to some of your podcasts. And the one I landed on that I've now listened to a couple times is your 10-year, 500th episode podcast anniversary. So let me just say, as someone who has been working on a podcast now for just a little over a year, wow, and congratulations. That is a massive milestone, Jay.
Well, thank you so much. It felt like a big milestone. You know, as I mentioned in that episode, I haven't really made a big deal of like how many episodes I've done. You know, I've always just considered it like an ongoing practice that I have, just like any other practice that I try to remain consistent on. But hitting the 10-year, 500 episode mark, I had to say to myself, wow, like I haven't ever missed a week. And, you know, as you know from doing podcasts, there are sometimes moments where you kind of would come up against the schedule where you're scheduled to release one and you haven't quite recorded one yet or whatever. And so given all the times that that's happened, that I never have missed a week, I felt like, wow, that was something that I wanted to own a little bit. I would also say that the podcast has always been like a place for me to kind of work through things, kind of learning in public. And I've always been very transparent about a bunch of stuff that yoga teachers are often not very transparent about, sort of taboo to talk about. And so for me, it's very cathartic to kind of do those episodes as well. And I do feel like we're at such a pivotal point right now in all the years that I've been a yoga teacher. So the response that I've gotten from that episode has felt kind of affirming and important. Not like it made everything better or anything, but just to like acknowledge that I'm not the only one who's observed some of these things and I'm not alone in it all has been rewarding. So I appreciate that that's the episode that you landed on.
Yeah. Oh, and I want to dive into so many things that you brought up in that episode. But I do just want to say, you know, there's that Yoga Sutra, I believe it's 114. Yoga happens when you practice for a long time without break in all earnestness. And the fact, I mean, that is yoga, what you have done with your podcast. It is unbelievable that you have not missed a week in 500 episodes and that you're doing it all. You have guests almost every week which requires, research and preparation and all of this. And then you do solos as well, but you are solo, right? Like I've got a partner in this who she records some, I record some, we record some together. And then this other branch of big ideas that I interview people. So all of those together fill our weekly slate. But you've been doing this all by yourself with guests every week. And it's just remarkable. Just the consistency alone, let alone the level of quality that your podcast hits every episode I've ever listened to. And I've been on your podcast, I believe 2, maybe 3 times. And you are an incredible interviewer. It's just, I don't want to turn this into just a praise fest, but it could be, because it's just a remarkable landmark that you've done, that you've continued to do, and that you do shine the light on a lot of, can we say, the dirty corners of the yoga room?
I guess. I don't know if the dirty sounds like it has all kinds of other implications, but I know what you meant. I do also just want to make a clarification. I did start the podcast with a partner. I had a guy named Josh who I worked with for a lot of years. And he helped with a lot of things with the podcast. But I would say in terms of generating the episodes and like recording them all, that's definitely been me. But I want to make sure to give Josh credit, even though we've parted ways. I want to make sure that he gets his due credit, because I didn't do it all by myself. You need help. And some of that help, comes from, the people who decide to do it. As you know, yoga teachers agreeing to come on and showing up on time and engaging with you is sort of what it's all about. So I wanted to put that in there.
Yes. No one is an island. Absolutely. It always takes a team to get even your solo work out there. And so, yes, I appreciate you saying that. So let's dive into some of the things that you brought up in that episode, because it really, it just sparked so many thoughts in my brain that I wanted to kind of untangle with you. So you're talking about sort of that we're at this crux point in the yoga world, and that for years we have been told as yoga teachers, yoga professionals, but also to the public at large, that the yoga world is growing, and there's, this many 35 million in the United States alone practitioners. And then there's this many people who say they want to practice, but they haven't started yet. And it's a growth industry, and there's billions of dollars to be made. And you just have to figure out how to get your slice of those billions. But really what's happening, and what you pointed out to some studies and reviews that have showed, that one-way growth chart is no longer going upwards, and it's either leveling, or maybe it's even starting to go down. And so maybe let's start there with this idea of the endless available yoga audience. Is that a real thing? As well as the online. That's really what made that feel so endless. If you live in a small town, you've got your boundary right there. But if you have access to online teaching, that's where that illusion of endlessness can come in. And so talk to us a little bit about how that felt when you read that article about that change in trajectory.
Well, I think that there's a couple different things to say to that question. First of all, I would distinguish like the growth of the yoga industry before the internet and after the internet. Like a lot of the early studies where they were marking the growth of the yoga industry, and it was like specifically the yoga industry often, it was based on, retreats and mats and clothes, as well as, classes. But the majority of the money was being made by like big corporations. That's like beyond yoga, just like in our culture in general, but the yoga world was certainly not immune from that once it became like more mainstream business. So there was this growth. And I remember, you pointed to someone seeing me at a yoga festival. There's only been so many yoga festivals that I've recorded live shows from, but they were often in the early years with Andrew Tanner. And then more recently with Andrew Tanner, we were just talking about the trajectory of the yoga industry as a service industry, he called it, which I recoiled against when he said that, because I remember it being like, you found teachers that you were inspired by. It still had this mystical, from the Eastern spirituality, wisdom traditions. When I got to yoga in the early 90s, it was different, than it became. And so there was this growth trajectory. I certainly rode the wave. Like certain people I talked to and myself who kind of came into being a yoga teacher within a certain window, I think we're able to kind of catch a wave and like have actually managed to have some kind of career of sorts, meaning that we've been able to pay our way as yoga teachers to some degree or another, sometimes for several decades, some of us. I haven't done any other jobs as an adult. I haven't done anything else except teach yoga since I was in my early 20s. I'm 53 now. So, for me, I caught this wave, and it certainly was an upward trajectory for a while. I taught at a lot of different centers for a lot of years until I was kind of like the senior teacher there. Then I opened my own yoga center, just like the yoga teachers before me had. And I had a place for 10 years, which was the amount of time that I was able to keep pace with the rising rents until the gentrification got to be too much and I couldn't keep up anymore. And I let go of having the yoga center. And then I was I guess what you'd call like a traveling yoga teacher trainer for a time. There was that model from like 2017 to 2020. There was this international travel circuit that I was on. And I wouldn't say I was kind of like a B-lister on it maybe, but I was on the circuit and you could see all these teachers. And I remember towards the end of it, like towards 2020, the markets was all moving into China. Everybody was going to China. Like you could kind of see there was like an international traveling yoga teacher thing. And then, the pandemic happens and everything goes online. Now, I was already online from an earlier time. That business partner I mentioned earlier, he was the person who said to me when I was going to close the center, listen, if you don't start like live streaming your classes right now, when you close the center, all these people you've made connections with over all these years, they're going to have no way to connect with you. But if you do this, you'll be able to do classes from your living room anywhere in the world, and they'll still be able to do classes with you. Of course, I fought with him at the time and thought it was ludicrous, his suggestion, but I did ultimately relent. And of course, he was right, and that became an important thing. As you know, later on, when the pandemic hit, people scrambled to get it together. I already had infrastructure and had been doing it for several years. So getting back to my original statement, there was like the growth before the internet, and then there was when the internet hit, and I certainly was an early adopter of that, even in terms of like blog writing and then doing the podcast. And certainly I did social media early on, but then social media totally changed. Like the game on the internet changed at a certain point. And I think that, more recently, since the pandemic, everybody went online, and there was like a little bit of a growth period online too. Like everybody was there. People were able to get in contact with teachers that they weren't normally able to get in contact with. People embraced online classes in a way they hadn't before. So I think some of us who rose to the challenge of the tech or whatever, kind of were able to kind of have a good year or two there even. However, I do think that there's been a big contraction, because there's just Zoom fatigue. People want to get off their screens. There was just too much screen time. And we're all talking about going for walks in nature. I was having you on the show so we could talk about energy medicine, you know what I mean? Because we were all cooped up inside looking at each other on screens. And so I think about a year and a half ago, myself, I just had this incredible impulse to like get back into spaces with people again. I had this moment, I always tell the story, but I literally sort of had an out-of-body experience where I just pulled back and I saw myself sitting in a room by myself with a laptop. And, I was connecting with people through the laptop, but it was just me by myself in a room. And I felt like the thoughts that came to my head is I'm in a Black Mirror episode. And I thought, oh my gosh, I want to do things in my life to try to like be in the room. I became more active in my neighborhood association. I was like, I got to try to do things. And ultimately I opened this yoga center in my neighborhood, and it's like a little 8 to 10 person room. It's just me teaching. I tried to have some other teachers come in, but that's a longer story. It hasn't exactly worked out. And I've been really having to face the stark reality of where you started in the question to kind of bring it back to your question, which is, as someone who has had 30 years of, being able to immerse myself in yoga practice, studying, teaching, having the opportunity to have the podcast and do this continuing education with all of these expert people, I feel like it's safe to assume that I have some expertise in what I do. I feel like I'm a very qualified yoga teacher, but in the market as it is right now, like the classes that are better attended, that's not what brings people in. Like the notion that you would gain this expertise over these many years, and that's would make you more valuable, and people would pay more to like study with you because of that. That just hasn't borne out to be true in my experience. And I'm okay with that. Like, I don't need to make a lot of money. I never have done this because I wanted to make a lot of money, but it has gotten to the point where a lot of people have had to make choices that they've not had to make in decades. I have someone coming on my podcast this week, as a matter of fact, who I really have known. We kind of have paralleled. And, at a certain point, her online sales dipped down so low, she had to take another job. She took a job at the Barnes and Noble. She loves it, by the way. It's a great job, like whatever. But like, I just think that there is a kind of stark reality. And then if you're on social media, you've got all these people, these sponsored ads telling you that if you take this business course, you can have your 6-figure yoga career. And they have these fancy schnazzy ads and these business plans. And I'm just sort of trying to be real about it. So that's what that thought was about that episode, is like, we have to be real about it. I'm somebody who has made my living as a yoga teacher for decades now. And it's definitely harder than it's ever been. And I do feel like I'm facing this crossroads where, I've got 2 kids, and, if enough money's not coming in for long enough, I have to do whatever I need to do,
Yeah. Yeah. There's sort of 2 arms of this that I want to talk to you about. But since we're here with the financial piece and the kind of saturation and maybe even some backlash in the yoga market, let's go there a little further. Because I want to also, say that you have been, this doesn't really totally sound right, but I'm going to say it, that you've been one of the lucky ones to be able to, like you said, you rode that crest early, and you've been able to only teach yoga for all of these decades, raising a family in a not inexpensive part of the world. That's pretty amazing. And I feel like there is a very small group of yogis, the kind of yoga celebrities, right, that really were able to, and you called yourself, you said you were a B-lister, but either way, you're on the list, right? And there's a handful, maybe a couple of dozen that really popped and made it big. And everyone else sort of kind of got sucked into the, yoga teacher training, and maybe I can make a living, but nobody else was really making exclusively a living doing yoga, unless they were really hustling. I have teachers that teach 17 classes a week, right? That is a big hustle, right? 6 different studios and all of that. And, and so this contraction that we're seeing now, or this maybe even backlash, I wonder if some of that is directly related to this sort of yoga cult of personality. And now we're seeing that not really bear out, because, yoga came to this country with the cult of personality and these promises that, spiritual revelation, transformation, calm, peace, all of the stuff that people think about or used to think about. Now it's gotten a little bit more medical, but there was that spiritual concept. And that was that first wave. And then the second and third wave just rose that cult of personality higher and higher. But those original people that came to this country and started spreading yoga, and then their lineages, there has been a lot of power and spiritual dynamics at work there. And let's just be frank, a lot of exploitation. And that exploitation, I don't think it kind of became baked in to what the yoga world was offering. Now, it still had that promise of transformation, spiritual enlightenment, all of the things, which is why so many people stayed with it and continue to. But there was also a lot of damage done, a lot of harm done from that original group, but then from the yoga celebrities, right? The cliques, all of the sort of subtle but powerful imbalance, power dynamics that caused a lot of people to really feel like, wow, this is yoga? Like, I remember feeling that when I first started in the yoga world myself. It was like, I thought everyone was going to just be open and friendly and kind and heart-centered. And it was like walking into a barrel of scorpions. I was like, oh my God, these are people doing spiritual practice. And here they are in front of the room talking about spiritual practice. And then as soon as you're out, they turn their back and the knives are out. And so I just wonder if there is some backlash to this idea. You talked about no one's looking for a quote teacher anymore, but these teachers have not really upheld the promise of what the ancient traditions have promised, unless you look at the ancient traditions truly through the lens of these were very exclusive practices taught only to the very, exclusive groups of people. And that whole idea that you were beholden to your teacher and that the teacher could do no wrong, even in the face of clearly horrific treatment, that actually is the lineage. I mean, that's really the lineage. And we don't need to name all the people that have had sexual abuse in their lineages, two of which I studied with deeply. And I mean, you just name them off and everybody knows these 7, 8, 12, some of them are still teaching. I don't know how that's happening. Anyway, that was a really long, winding road there, but I'd love to. I mean, that's what your podcast really brought up for me. This idea of like, wow, well, maybe this is the kind of we bake the cake and here's what we put in the ingredients.
Well, I just really appreciate you bringing that line up because I think you're onto something. Certainly, part of where we are now and why expertise is not as valued as we might have imagined it would be is because of what you're saying, is because there were incredibly profound falls from grace that happened in terms of who was like the authority for yoga. And then there was all this sort of stuff that we got told about yoga early on that later on we've kind of come to learn wasn't true. People made stuff up, there was all kinds of stuff. The abuse that you were talking about, I think was often baked in. Some people can try to make some case for like cultural crossovers. And I think that there's some legitimacy to that. But I think as soon as yoga kind of hit the West and started to become more standardized and scaled up, I always talk about it. Like, even if you talk to people who studied with Mr. Iyengar or Mr. Patabi Joyce when there was only 5 or 10 people in the room compared to when there was 600 people in the room or whatever later on, you're getting a very different experience, and all kinds of things happened, like you say, where, there was baked in what I think is a good term, like somatic dominance, even to this day, where it's almost like in certain schools of practice where the teacher is the person who decides when you get the next pose. And it's sort of like there's a certain role of a teacher where they're the one who knows better for you than you, or something to that suggestion. And I think many of us have moved very far away from that because we've seen harm come from that. And that's why I do think that at the same time, there has been quite an evolution where things that we were doing in the 90s and early aughts as like standard stuff in yoga teachers, you would never think of doing that in a yoga class now. Teacher training specifically teach teachers that they would never do. We were way more reckless in the early golden growth days where we were just people opening up storefronts and doing all kinds of crazy stuff, standing on people's backs. I did all kinds of reckless things in the early days because that's what my teachers were doing to me. Mm-hmm. And so we were just kind of modeling this. I think people have gotten more educated. I think people want to be good teachers and they want to be authentic. And it should also be said, not all teachers were horrible and abusive. That while there were these masters and these systems and those threads, I know there were many, many people who had teachers who treated them with deep kindness. And there's reasons why people care about yoga so much. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us, had to face these really difficult paradoxes where you had a teacher who really taught you things that really helped you on a profound level and that you still utilize to this day. And then they also behaved in ways that you cannot condone. And you felt that you needed to separate yourself from them because of that. It's hard to reconcile that, I think that's something that we've talked about on my show. We've talked about that on my show because that's just something that teachers have had to reconcile. And I think that there has been a lot of good that's come out of that. I do think that teachers are taking on a role that is less that way now and in certain ways more honest. Because teachers have felt a need to be more transparent. The reason why we're having a conversation like this and putting it out for the public to listen to is because we want to be transparent about what we're doing and we want to be held to account and we don't want to fall into the same pitfalls that we watch these other teachers fall into. Yeah. So I think that there is new things that have, come about. But I do think that there has been a change in terms of the way people think of what a yoga teacher is. That most of the time these days, it's just on the same line with Pilates and HIIT. People don't necessarily think of yoga teachers as these spiritual friends or like as much of a spiritual practice as when you and I first got inspired to become yoga teachers. And there's still people out there, who, I have a small group of people who've come and can appreciate it, but it's not marketable in the same way that it once was. There was a time where it felt like yoga teachers were in a position to be shaping the market. Like you said, there were these yoga celebrities for a time, but then there was a little bit of a leveling of the playing field with the social media, honestly. At a certain point, there was this kind of leveling and I started my own platform and it felt like you could shape things. That's why I came up with gentle is the new advanced, which has worked for me quite well to kind of like try to put something out there to try to make gentle chair yoga sexy or something, because you had all these people doing like Adidas ads and, sweating with black and white, like making it look all cool. So to try to compete. And it was about trying to compete in the marketplace, but it felt like there was more of an even playing field. At some point, it did feel like there was a shift. And again, it's not just in the yoga world. It's in the broader sphere and on the internet. There was a change in the algorithms. And at a certain point, I remember having this conversation with my business partner at the time, and he said, I don't think that social media is doing anything for you right now. And he wanted to stop doing it. And I argued with him again. Then we did a test. We just stopped doing Facebook posts. And we looked at our download numbers and our sales numbers. No change. Then we stopped doing Instagram. And we stopped doing it all. And we saw an increase in email subscribers and sales. And we started to realize, wow, the social media was, for me at least, I don't know that that's true for everybody. And that was some years ago. Things are different now. It's rapidly changing. But I got off of social media many years ago for that reason. And it was about kind of staking your own little claim on the internet, you know? Mm-hmm. You've done that to some degree, I know. Mm-hmm. So that was something that we've been able to do. But even that has felt harder because, like you pointed to, there is this more saturation. You know, honestly, people can get a ton of actually good yoga classes for free on YouTube. You know, for years, we sort of tried to convince yoga teachers not to do that, but it's been done. It's there, you know, There's plenty of good yoga. I just recorded with someone who came to yoga doing YouTube videos. Mm-hmm. And in the past, I would have kind of been like, oh gosh, I would have really thought we've really lost something. But I had to admit to myself that, you know, I've had a lot of people on, and when I ask them how they first got to yoga, these famous yoga teachers, they'll say something like, oh, I had Richard Hittleman's book, or I watched Lilius Folan on the TV, or I had a Rodney Yee DVD. And for the first year, they just used this book or this DVD. Is that really all that different than a YouTube video? Probably not.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the same time, we know, probably people listening to this too, who care enough about yoga to listen to something like this, also know that there is something incredibly universal and profound about people coming together into a space, and breathing and moving together and having shared intention. And it's such a crazy paradox right now because I'm struggling financially and I'm not sure what to do, but I have Peggy, the 76-year-old woman who lives down the street who comes, who, you know, we're hugging each other because she's going to get her cataract surgery. You know, I mean, just like really beautiful human. The whole reason I'm a yoga teacher and why I opened the place, I am actually getting some of that. It's the money part so it's trying to reconcile that, you know? And also just trying to be honest about stuff because I feel like yoga teachers are made to feel like they're inadequate or they're not good or they're not marketing themselves right. And I don't know that that's true, depending on what you want to do with yoga. And even some of these things where someone will have a really good year, you know, like you can have one good year, but to have like, we started 10 years is a whole other thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, it is. We're in a really difficult climate, but I'm not sure that it ever wasn't difficult. I think maybe it's now difficult for some of the people that it wasn't difficult for before. I'm not like picking on you specifically, but like,
I hear what you're saying.
You know, like,
well, I'll say that's true. I'd say it's more difficult for everybody, even smaller, like newer teachers coming in, they don't have the same opportunities. They don't have local centers to grow as teachers like we did. Yeah. You know, I agree. I agree that it's a very privileged place to be like, oh, I can't make my living teaching yoga anymore, where the majority of people haven't been able to make a living. And let's be clear, when I say that, you know, I'm talking like $40,000 to $60,000 a year. I'm not talking a lot of money. When they say six-figure careers, I have lived incredibly modestly my whole life. Me and my wife are artists. We live in a modest way in order for me to be able to do it. Now, sometimes when people talk about yoga careers, though, and you hear people to this day being like, do this and you'll have a six-figure yoga career. And I'm like, yeah. Like you said earlier, the amount of people who are really making a living teaching yoga is much less than I think people actually imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the vision of how you held yourself as a yoga teacher, I think in those early days, I also started in the early 90s at Jivamukti and have studied with a lot of different people. And I feel like there were opportunities and still there always were the gatekeepers, and there still are. And there still is that like sort of cliquey cadre that is still holding on to power, right? I do really see that happening. And the opportunities, I mean, all you have to do is look at the few live events that are still happening, right? The few yoga festivals and retreats and whatnot, conferences that are still happening. And you see the same teachers, right? The same handful, the same 20 teachers that are teaching at all of these. they're not, whoever's leading these festivals are not open to new teachers and not interested in bringing up the next levels of, they're just bringing in the same teachers. And some of those teachers are some of those teachers that have caused harm in the yoga world in large ways that are still not being held accountable to anybody. And they're some of the ones that are making those. I mean, in my 40 to 60,000 to me and to a lot of yoga teachers, that sounds like was not wisdom. It was straight up abuse. And there was a lot of beautiful learnings in there, which makes it, again, it's like gets you a little Stockholm syndrome, right? It's like, this work is amazing. My life is transformed. And yet I'm also sort of being abused at the same time. So what do I do with that information? Subtle or overt on the abuse level there. And so I really think that we have to, as yoga teachers, transform how we view ourselves. I don't dislike the idea of yoga as a service industry. I talk about this all the time, that I am here in service of this work and in service of my students. And when you need me, I am here for you, to serve you. And I've had many teachers that is not what they think at all. They are here to diva around and and to share their drops of amrit and then be, I'm just going to say it, assholes in real life. So I think that part of what's going on is like a real big, that's not what anybody wants anymore, even though there's still those tendrils of, hanging on to that old view.
Your points are well made. I guess I would make a little bit of distinction in terms of like, some people talk about wisdom as that is something that's like bestowed upon you. And then there's gatekeepers of that wisdom. And I tend to think of wisdom, you and I have talked about even like tapping into wisdom field or innate wisdom or collective wisdom or the wisdom of the universe. There's places, sources of wisdom that we've found that are pointed to in yoga practice. So I would say that I do think that there's like principles of practice. There are some universal things, focusing your attention and quieting yourself inside so you can hear different voices and find a voice of inner knowing. Like there's very universal principles of practice that, again, are the transformative thing that have helped a lot of people. Then there's all the other stuff that you're pointing to that we have had to reckon with that gets in the way of it. And I agree with you that it needs to be reckoned with. I've been very vocal in doing that on my show for years, like trying to have those conversations as difficult as they've been. And they're important conversations and they continue to need to happen. There was a recent scandal. I didn't weigh in because it wasn't my community, but I was kind of shocked to hear that it was still happening. You kind of felt like we had maybe moved on some or gotten a little bit smarter, but we haven't. Now, the other thing that you're pointing to, I do think is interesting. And it is about yoga celebrity. And I joked about, being a B-lister or whatever. But, I, like you, have been in a position to observe A-list yoga celebrity, yoga teachers. And, I've had a chance to interact with a lot of them on the show too. And I don't want to throw everybody into one bucket. A lot of them are really well-known teachers who haven't done anything horrible to anybody, you know what I mean? And they've been very successful because they were early adopters, and they've been grandmas and grandpas and fathers to a lot of yoga teachers. And I want to be respectful and have respect to teachers that have come before us. I think we would be silly not to do that.
Yes.
At the same time, like you, I've also observed people seem to be very eloquent teachers in the teaching space, but then when you like have dinner with them afterwards, they don't seem to be much of an example of that.
Yeah.
And that was certainly a learning experience for me, in terms of like what it is to have like a public persona. And, again, like I said, trying to kind of have it be this transparent thing, sometimes even to a fault, maybe, but because of seeing a kind of two-sidedness to it, or really recognizing that the teachers who really did have an impact on me, the teachers, even the ones maybe who didn't have the complicated issues, but other teachers who've had impact on me that didn't, a lot of it was an example that they set. They were modeling something about how they were as people.
Yes.
And so to me, that's always become more the mark of the fruition of someone's practice is the person, and the way they behave. And so that has certainly been helpful for me in terms of discerning, what you're talking about. Because I've been able to avoid a lot of the dramas and whatever for that reason, to just sort of notice, oh, okay, and it does feel somewhat kind of lonely there. But again, most of it happens on a grassroots level. It's in the classes that you're teaching every day. It's not the promise of the internet at some point was supposed to be that growth too. It was supposed to connect us to the whole wild world. And it did start to do that. It can still do that. I still have people on other time zones who take classes with me. It's still helpful, but it doesn't connect us to our community right where we live. It doesn't connect us to our environment. So many of the things that I remember us talking about being important in the past together, and why yoga is valuable and important. So I think for me, I recently gave this talk to these other yoga teachers, and it was about the internet and using the AI and stuff. And I was just talking about the need to kind of draw lines, just like we've needed to draw boundaries, ways as teachers that we've had to do to like address some of the harms that have happened. I think we're also need to start drawing some lines around the technology too. If we're going to retain the essence of things, and it's not going to be lost to chatbots.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you keep bringing up, and so let's just bring that up and make, put a pin in that for everyone, that there are some incredible, many, I would say for the most part, most yoga teachers are very in their integrity and what they're offering, and they want that. They want, you talked on your podcast about people continuing education to become better yoga teachers. And on the one point to be able to earn more, but on the other point, most people are doing it because they want to learn more, not earn more. They want to learn more. They want to grow themselves individually. But I just think, and I don't want to belabor this point, but I do think that some of this backlash we're seeing and some of the transformation in the yoga world, one of the huge changes was the pandemic, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But one of the other pieces of that, I think, has been this maybe overexposure along with that harm that has really made people think of, like, why am I following you, right? It's like all of these yoga teachers like, follow me, follow me, follow me. But like, I'm actually not being such a great person. And then everyone's like, well, why are we following you? And then, of course, with the rise of the internet and social media in particular, where everyone's like, follow me, follow me, follow me. And everyone's following everybody else. And like, who's leading, right? There's no leadership. But maybe that's what we're coming to, is nobody wants to be led. Everybody wants to just sort of throw what they've got into the pot. And, like you said, classes now are just like hit or, me. And so then everybody is going to follow and hit and like and do all this other stuff that they're trying, because people, I think, are still people and they're still seeking something. And more people are really seeking for a transformational spiritual experience. What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose here? I feel like as the world gets more and more fractured, and as our global politics gets uglier and uglier, that grassroots, which you mentioned, is really rising, because people are like, okay, top down is not the way. This is awful. But when I look around my own small community, all I see is goodness. And so let me put my attention and my energy there. So let's turn to that, because you did just that thing. You said, okay, this global big push is not working. Let me open a small studio in my actual neighborhood and see what comes up. And so I want to talk about that, because one of the things that's so powerful that you said, this is post-pandemic, people are wanting intimacy and yet they don't want it to, at the same time. They're afraid of it. They're looking for arm's length intimacy or arm's length participation. And so I just found that so fascinating, because I agree with that 100%. I want you to talk a little bit more about that so our listeners really know what you meant by that statement.
Absolutely. I think you're right that there's certainly a lot of repercussions to compare what I'm doing at my yoga center that I opened here a year and a half ago to what's happening at the other yoga centers where I live. So I'm familiar with the number of the other yoga centers. There was also a center that opened right at the same time that I opened downtown, which is a little bit away. I don't know that we're in that much competition, but we are and are not, you know. But I decided to go back to what I felt was like my early roots. So I had literally a cigar box with cash in it. And then I've got a sign-in sheet. I've got punch cards with the punch cards. You remember like we used to do?
Yes.
I do have an online option. If someone wants to do the QR code and pay with Venmo or credit card, they can. I even have a thing online. If they want to do it online and register online, they can, but they don't have to have a membership. I'm not trying to sell memberships. I'm not trying to have it be a subscription like online. Everything's a subscription online, but I tried to go back to it being about the yoga practice and like go back to this other business model. And I don't need a lot of people. It's all about like scale and overhead and how many people want to come to this. At the same time, you know, you've got the center down in downtown, and I'm not joking. My center is called the Birdhouse Yoga Center. It's inspired by a birdhouse in my backyard where I watched these birds nest, and I got inspired to make a nest. Place downtown is literally called The Void. That is the name. It's called The Void. And I don't mean to knock them. I know that people have great classes there, but it's all hot. It says, the first thing on their website says, all of our classes are hot. And it is the boutique fitness model that we've been talking about on the show. And, you know, in fairness, I'm not even trying to knock it. You know, right now, you know, you made these comments earlier about the gatekeepers, and I think you're right about that. But it's hard to do anything right now. And I know yoga teachers who've gotten opportunities to teach at a boutique fitness type yoga center and they're very quality yoga teachers. And the idea is that that place is going to bring in enough money so that you can have those kind of yoga teachers there. You can definitely make a case for it. It's not all horrible. I have certainly expanded my own movement diet as I've gotten older, and I like to do other things too. Again, I'm not trying to like be this purist or something, but to the question that you're asking, what I have observed is that there is a very profound repercussion that has happened from the pandemic and from the kind of reconditioning that happened, where people experienced life where they didn't have to go out and everything could be delivered to their door. And I watched it with my kids. We had all these boundaries around the screens, and then that pandemic happened. The schools gave them the iPads. It all flew out the window. You know, the other parents are giving their kids way earlier than we are. We're trying to keep them away for as long as we can, you know, like there's been a shift. So what I've observed is, you know, my type of practice, and I know your practice to be the same because I know people who've studied with you, it's based on an intimate exploration with your experience. You have to be with yourself in an intimate way to notice what we're inviting people to notice. And people, you're right. It's more needed than ever. That's the cliche thing to say. It's absolutely true. But the point is that people have been conditioned to such that it isn't comfortable. It doesn't have the immediate kind of gratification. The classes that are best attended right now are hot classes and aerial classes. And it's because the experience of those classes provides a more immediate gratification than you're going to get from having to do like subtle movement explorations that ultimately make you have to face your inner behind it to get there. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that argument is a very good argument, but I do think that you can present people with practice that's, you know, more geared in certain ways towards like down regulation of the system. And there's all these ways that I think yoga teachers are finding to kind of offer practices that invite people into a more subtle experience. But their classes are smaller attended. And a lot of those people are having to find other ways to have multiple sources of income, as they say, to be able to do it. But I think that bit about it being arm's length, I think that is certainly bigger than the yoga world. I just see that in people in general, you know, even just like other parents at the pickup or whatever. It's people want intimacy, but have been conditioned to like be a little bit averse to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I wanted to you said, you know, we all kind of thought that the physicality was the gateway, right? And then you'd get into the deeper experiences. But really, I think the physicality won, right? Like hot yoga, hot vinyasa flow, that is the moneymaker in the yoga world right now. So that our idea for that, so many of us that teach many more of what, again, air quotes for the subtle practices, that we've been waiting, the physical one. But the flip side of that also, I think, and you did talk about this as well on that 500th episode podcast. I think the other thing, if we're going to take that away, that the intense physical practice is not the gateway to the spiritual path that we hoped that it was for many of us. I mean, I started at Jiva Mukti. Strictly physical. I was living in New York City. I'm not a runner. I don't have money to join a gym. That was my outlet. And I went in there and wow, was that ever an outlet? Like I was sweating, I was crying, like it was everything. But it was a very intense physical practice. And it, of course, because Jivamukti was a, 8-limbed full meal deal, even with the rock music pumping in the background, it led me to the other practices. And I think it does do that to some people. But I think if we look at the aggregate as a whole, the physical has won. Except, here's where I feel like there's a really strong difference. And this has been true for years, no matter what your age. Injury from those intense practices, especially Ashtanga, everyone blowing out their shoulders, blowing out their elbows, blowing out their wrists, right? From Ashtanga, all the jump backs. Then they're still addicted, especially if you're an Ashtanga, you're addicted to the physical. And now you're compromised physically. So what do? And then you end up learning all and studying all the other limbs. You had said in this podcast that your demographic, as does mine, for very similar reasons, skews older, and that the younger demographic doesn't have the access to or the desire really to tackle those difficult yogic questions that come up once you start doing those deeper practices. But I think that we're going to see, and I have already, and I wonder if you have, actually seen increases as those hot vinyasa flow people get older, and the practice is not adjusting to them, but they are adjusting. Their bodies are changing, and the practice isn't meeting them anymore. Yoga will meet you where you are, but all of a sudden it's like yoga's not meeting me anymore, and now I need something different. And so I wonder if you're seeing that in your studio and your practices as well.
Well, I mean, I think that it's interesting. You kind of said that the physicality has won. And that's, I guess if I'm being a little bit more cynical about it, that's where I think it has been a bit of a not a good thing that we put so much emphasis on asana, because I think if someone goes to yoga classes for years and the teacher doesn't really hold some kind of like deeper, more contemplative idea about it, even if it's never spoken about, even if the teacher just is doing it and doesn't even say anything about it in the asana class, I don't know that people always find their way to it. So if they become disenchanted, if they become injured, they're like, oh yeah, yoga's injurious, so they go to Pilates instead. So I don't know that you get that same progression. Now, I do think sometimes even despite it, like even there are people who started out in Bikram and for whatever reason, in that one pose or in that Shavasana that they had or whatever, they had a glimmering glimpse of sattva and they decided that yoga is now going to be a thing in their life. And it's always been since, so there's a deeper wisdom, as we were pointing to earlier, an intuitive wisdom that happens despite all the crappiness and all the stuff in the way often too. I mean, I guess it's a much more of a minority. And again, that's not about masses or growing big platforms or making money. That's just nature and life and love working its way through. So I think in terms of the young people, I have a college right here. Lafayette College, it's right here. And I definitely had it in mind, like in the past, when you opened a yoga center, being in a college town was like one of the things you would do, because it was the younger people who were more hip to Eastern spirituality, or it wasn't the old people who were whatever, it was the younger people, always. I don't know that that's not been true. I think they have access to all kinds of stuff. They're all more comfortable doing stuff online. They do get stuff from the school program, I think. Most 60, 70% of the people coming here are over age 60, and they really appreciate me and what I do and being the kind of person I am. They had enough of their life without the internet first to remember. I would say I have had, some of the college kids come in, and it's awesome. And they're really great. Like, it was actually very encouraging to have them come in, to kind of see a good group of them say, yeah, we're all going to leave our phones and go take this weird yoga class and whatever. They all came and it was fun. But I can't say that there's been any who've made it regular and come again and again and again. They've tried it, they've checked it out. I do remember my one glimmer of hope as I did meet this one younger person, and they had a phone, and on the phone, it was just like text, didn't have any colors, and I was like, what's that? She said, oh, it's a minimalist, where it took all of the like colored icons for all the apps and all the stuff and just made it a text link of just white on black. And she said, yeah, like looking at the screen was really stressing me out a lot. So I got this app and it's way better. And I was like, oh, you see, that's what I can see. Like if we're good, we need the technologies. We can't get away from the technologies, but is there a way to kind of like draw lines? And like, I was like, that's cool. So to see a younger person, I don't know that that's a real trend, but it's kind of like a hope that there'll be a thread of the younger generations who will kind of recognize where there needs to be some boundaries set around this so we can kind of keep ourselves in an analog way, you know?
I mean, so that we can keep our humanity, really, you know, and the glimpses of hope that I see in that, you know, there's a lot of school districts that are outlawing phones in the school day, and the kids self-reporting, not even like no other, self-reporting. They are happier. They are thrilled to have their phones taken away. Like, so I think there is this movement from the younger generation that was born with the phone in their hand, that they're like, hey, I want to engage, like you said, in an analog level. And, you know, EM yoga started at Norwich University. And so I literally birthed this style of yoga with these 18 to 21-year-old, predominantly men. There was maybe, which is so different, right? Predominantly men. And they were all going into different branches in the military. So you could say you could be as far away from what you think the yoga world would be. And my classes were packed week after week after week after week, because these students who were in university, which is already high stress, and then in, you know, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, going for special ops. So stress levels higher than any of us at university could even imagine. They really wanted to learn this technology, the yoga technology, because they knew there was some part of them that still resonated like that. So no matter what's going on with the technology in the world, I do believe that there is a part of us that is stronger than that really resonates with that person-to-person communion. And so back to your point of that we're both wanting and not wanting this intimacy after the pandemic, I see it also. I see it in myself, and I see it in the world around me too, how, you know, I'm a real introvert. And so one of my, there were many blessings from the pandemic. Let's not throw all of that away, right? We did learn a lot. There was a lot of actually beautiful things that came out of it. But for me, it was also like a time where, I don't have to go anywhere, right? And so now that I'm going out into the world again, I'm seeing how what you just said, that desire for intimacy, but also that resistance of it at the same time. And so I think I hope that there is a lot of juice as well as gratitude towards programs like you are starting to do, where we are coming together again. And there's a lot in the yogic traditions that can teach us about how to cultivate this intimacy that most of us fear. I think that's really what it is that's stopping people from actually connecting. And the internet and the social media has not helped us connect, even though that was its broad dictate. It has actually ripped us apart, and it has allowed us to feel connected on a mental level, but not really to feel connected on a soul level. And it is encouraged, this is obvious, you know, the worst of us to present. And then when we're faced with real intimacy, which is messy, when there's conflict and when how do you do that? I think the yogic teachings can enlighten us on how to move through these really difficult things, only if they are taught and shared in a way, back to our beginning, right? Where it's transparent, where it's open, where I'm not saying I have all the answers and I'm the one and follow me and I will teach you how to do da 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 da, but to like open my heart and to say to you, I'm here on the path with you, right next to you. Let's work this through together. I think that might be the next step in this yoga evolution. What do you think? What do you think the next step of yoga's not going anywhere? And you said that we are now not able to shape the market so much anymore. It's shaped by, the big conglomerates that are making the billions. But what if we could? How could we, and how would you, if you could and would, shape this next step of the yoga world?
Well, I think it's already happening to some degree. I think it does have to do with scale. And there's that expression like Sangha is the new guru, where the kind of relationships that you're developing or the dynamic between teachers and students where it's more mutual and more transparent, as you're describing, becomes a place for people to learn together rather than for it to be someone who top down, as you said, or even if somebody in the room has been at it longer than you and has something to share, they're doing it in a way that's not setting themselves up in any kind of hierarchical way as much as possible. And often trying to employ techniques like transparency and other things to make sure that they're not putting themselves in that position. Because teachers don't want to act like they know what other people need to do, because we don't. So I think that has happened, to some degree. Now, I do think that there's, as we were discussing, still challenges, and some of those things are just practical matters, like I mentioned this, that people's schedules are more asynchronous. So when I opened the center, I put out what we used to do in the old days, which was just like a weekly recurring schedule. So it just said Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday out across the top. And then there were times down a grid, but it didn't say what month or the numbers for each day. It was just a recurring schedule. And people literally didn't really know how to read it. Like, people kept emailing me and calling me. They didn't understand how to read the schedule anymore because people become so accustomed to looking at the way that the schedule is on their phone. People couldn't even read the schedule. I didn't even think about it. I just used the template from my center that I had from 2007 to 2017. I didn't even think about it. So I think some of it is that there has been a deep conditioning in terms of us being in a digital world and the way people's lives function. Even the older people who come to my class, their grandchildren are still on schedules that aren't as regular. People coming to the same class the same day every week is less common than it used to be.
Yeah.
At the same time, I certainly appreciate what you're saying. I have always felt that there was some deeper calling or forces at work, as we've discussed, that are really what make it transformative. And when you do have an experience through practice yourself or through your experience of life as a result of practices, and you do feel like you're in a position to share in a way with other people where they could benefit from that as well, there is this incredibly wonderful thing that can happen. And it's why we're still at it after all these years, because it is something that makes it feel worthwhile, even when you're not making a lot of money. It's a soul glorifying, you know what I mean? Depending on people how conceive of these things, it's Holy Spirit. It's a lot of beautiful things. And that has given me a lot of purpose and meaning and direction in my life. So I'm sticking with it. The obstacle is when your soul fulfillment also becomes a way to make a living, which is what we've been talking about. And then at a certain point, it seems like what you have to do to make a living starts to in some way compromise the soul fulfillment aspect of it. And how do you navigate that? And I just think that a lot of people have decided that they're not, I certainly have decided there's things I'm just not going to do, even though they would probably make me money. And if that means me having to get some other job too, then I'll just have to get some other job too, because it's too valuable and important and meaningful to me to do anything that feels like it would compromise it. And I think in the past, there was a lot more room where we're like, oh, well, this is the way business is done. I had that business partner because I needed an asshole to do stuff that I don't want to do. You know what I mean? Like, and you need a shark to play you talked about it. You're like, the knives come out. So you need somebody to be there who doesn't mind taking the knives out. And at a certain point now I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. Even if that means not being a yoga teacher anymore, I'm not going to do it. I know what it is now. I know what it is to take business courses and and have spreadsheets and try to come up with strategies to grow your platform and what you would do to do that, and to dump the money into the social media ads and the kind of ads you have to make and the kind of stuff I have to do with making the selfie videos that you see people making or whatever. Like, I'm not going to do it. I've done it in the past. There was a time for that where it felt not so shitty. Now it doesn't feel right anymore to me. And I think for me, part of what I've been sort of kind of grappling with is, okay, I'm not
so that you don't have to compromise your core values. Like, to me, those go in your bio. That's the kind of yoga teacher that I want to study with, right? Somebody that is not trucking in the bullshit, transparent, humble, sharing the teachings that you have steeped yourself in. So I know in your podcast and in the blog post that sort of kind of went closely with it, you said towards the end, and it sort of was a little, I want to quite get it right, that you're not totally optimistic about the future of yoga, but that you're not giving up yet, but that you're not totally, and you sort of said a couple of times like that, like, I'm not giving up, but I really I'm not so excited about it, but I'm still with it. I just don't know what's going to. So I know you tried and you did really eloquently say your piece in both of those podcasts and blog posts, but share with us as we start to wrap up this podcast. And, you sort of just did. You're not going to compromise. And if you have to do something else, you will. That's you personally. What is if anyone has a global view on the yoga world, 10 years, 500 episodes, you've talked to everybody in the game. What do you see? Can you give us a new little J. Brown crystal ball? Do you have any thoughts about like where we're going or how we could go there better?
Well, first, to the point that you're making about me kind of wanting to be optimistic, but then admitting that I'm not feeling that way. I think that there's a thing where, as yoga teachers, we've developed some ability to have a little say about your lens of perception. Like, I can view a situation, even right now, I've got somebody in my family with a bad diagnosis, someone's sick, and I can see how on one level it's terrible, but on the other level, how it's had an effect on us, that we're like really caring about things in different ways. And you know how when you face those inflections and those difficulties, like, I can see, I've trained myself to be able to find the golden thread in death, so it's like, I can do that. And I think there's been a thing, and it's a bit of a product of what we've talked about, of yoga teachers having to become brands and being on social media, where you would always want to paint yourself in the best possible light. Like, you wouldn't want to get on social media and show everyone how messed up you are. You know what I mean? Like, you're always trying to paint this best picture of success. You're creating an image of success around you, And so I want to be optimistic. And if some part of me in the past would put on more rose-colored glasses, and I can find a way to describe my situation that's hopeful and like looking towards the future. And I heard it in your question. You're like, yes, how can we do this better? And, I want to go there. I really do. I want to end this podcast with you like that because, I read back to 2017 and I was writing the same thing. I was like, let's figure out a way to not be perpetuating the same cycles. I'm with you. I believe in that. But I'm also having to be very honest with myself. I've got this center now. It's not bringing in enough money, really. So I've had to fund it. It brings in some money, but not enough. So I'm funding it off what I'm doing online, but there's been some contraction with that. So I'm facing a really stark reality financially. It's just the truth. And so for me, there's that reality, and I have to be honest with myself, and I have responsibilities, and you have to be responsible. You can't be having your rose-colored glasses to the extent that you're not being smart or responsible about your life or something. At the same time, it is still working in some ways. And the daily experiences I have, every time I get to the place where I'm like, okay, maybe I just have to really switch gears, something happens, the money shows up that I needed or whatever, or some class I have with someone just fills me up in this way. And I'm just like, how could this not be the thing that I'm supposed to be doing? So it's still working and I'm still confident. I'm more confident than ever about what I'm doing. And it's just trying to navigate the world. And I think, again, it's a much bigger problem than the yoga world. This is a societal thing that we're facing in terms of technology and the way we're interacting with ourselves and other people. And all kinds of forces that are our work that are beyond us. So to your question, all I can offer, which is not any kind of a crystal ball, because I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't think anybody does. But I do think we said it earlier, that there are things that I can observe to be true with my own experience. And that is what yoga's taught me, that to develop some awareness about what your experience is, to be able to observe it and maybe even articulate it sometimes from time to time. And then that puts you in a position to make some choices, to have a little bit of say about what's going in to your eyes and your ears and your mouth and what you're engaging in, where you're putting your attention. And that is where I'm discerning truth from. And I think because of that, I am sleeping okay at night. And I feel like my relationships are relatively healthy despite challenges. And I think that is an anchor for me. It's been tried and true at this point to me that there is still something real and true, despite all the abuse, despite all the bullshit lies that we're told. There's still something that I can identify in my own experience and in my observation of other people's experience who are practicing with me that is true and feels right. And my gut says, please just keep at it. And then again, we'll deal with things as they come. And I'm being honest with myself so that I can be open to whatever needs to happen. And like you said, kind of giving the heart the priority rather than the profession, that can't be so attached to it. As much as I can't imagine doing anything else, I'm not attached to being a successful yoga teacher. I don't care about that. I care about why I'm a yoga teacher and the direction and purpose and meaning that it provides. And the profession has to be secondary to that.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love that. Thank you. Thank you, Jay, for this and all you have done over the years to shine the light into those dusty corners of the yoga studio rooms.
Yeah.
And I love you do, I feel, have this natural optimism that I think is really powerful because of all of the shit that we've talked about now and in years past in this world, in this space, and that it's not unique to yoga, and that there's challenges in every area of the world. And we're going to have to get together ourselves and figure them out because top down isn't working in any scenario any longer. And so we really are the ones we've been waiting for, and we need to we need to get together and be support and strong and wise for each other. And so I feel really grateful that you're in my community and that I get to partake in the wisdom that you share. And I'm just really grateful for your time today. It's been a lot of fun. I hope maybe you'll come back again.
Absolutely. Anytime. This is the kind of conversation that I feel fueled by. You know, it's a recognition of like what's really going on and where we're at. And, you know, not everybody, even among yoga teachers, can show up for that in the way that you showed up to have that conversation with me today. And I'm just forever grateful for it. So I agree. Coming together and finding, you know, people who you can engage with and learn with. And I'm just going to say this, and maybe this is the next podcast. I do think like finding guidance from sources higher than ourselves. You know, we talked about deeper wisdom sources. You know, sometimes I feel like there's a little too much emphasis, like self-helpy, it's all on you. And I do think that if I'm being really honest, a lot of times these days, I'm getting help from something bigger than me. And I just want to put that out there too. That yoga teachers have shied away from that in the past. I have, and now I'm not. I'm saying, you know, God and divine guidance is a real thing. So I feel compelled to just throw that in here at the end as well, just to say that.
I love that. Let's put that as a breadcrumb, because that is not anything that I ever shy away from. And let's talk about that. Let's put in the schedule another conversation, and we will follow the tendrils of the divine into our next conversation. How does that sound?
I am game anytime.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay. And all of you out there listening, tune in to the next time that me and Jay come back to talk about big ideas of the spirit and the field and God and the divine. I love that we've already got our next one lined up. Thank you so much, Jay, for your time today.
You're very welcome. This has been super fun. Thanks.